welcome everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay. Welcome to our latest installment of our mini-series of Zoom calls. If I may run through a little bit of Zoom etiquette first. I'm sure most of you are well versed in Zoom etiquette now. If you could make sure that you are on mute, please, for your speaker, and then that just ensures that everybody will be able to hear the presentation. The call is being recorded as long as the technology works, so you may choose to turn your video off as well. We are going to talk today about the Solomon Islands. So for any of you that have not joined any of our little mini series of Zoom calls before, the idea is that in this period where sadly we can't travel, we managed to transport you from your living rooms to some of the best diving areas in the world, and allow you to enjoy them and learn a little bit about them and go on some virtual dives. So my name's Phil from Dive Worldwide, and we also have Charlie with us. If you'd like to say hello, Charlie.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me.
So Charlie has been to the Solomons a few years back. I think, was it around 2016, Charlie, something like that?
2016. Yeah.
2016, yeah. So Charlie is going to tell us all about his trip. This is a two-part, if you like, for this region of the world. We've got Charlie talking about the Solomon Islands today, and then on, I believe it's the 31st of March, Sarah and I are going to be talking about Papua New Guinea, both of which are sort of in the same region of the world. In a moment, I'll hand over to Charlie to run through his presentation, and he'll be sharing his screen. We do have a chat function on Zoom, which you'll find down the bottom. If you have any questions, please do just write them on the chat, and we'll endeavour to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Charlie, I shall hand over to you. And I hope you all enjoy our little tour to the Solomon Islands.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Phil. Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for your time. Greatly appreciate it, because I know there's quite a few other things going on out there right now. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to bring up the presentation. So hopefully, Phil, can you confirm that you can see that? Yeah, you can see it. Okay, so I will carry on as that. So presentation obviously is about the Solomon Islands. I call it the wrecks, reefs and relics, a land where time stands still. The reason being is that the predominant reason for certainly my trip when I was out there was diving some wrecks, but a lot of reefs, and then relics, really sort of reminiscent of the Second World War, because the Solomon Islands played a strategic part in the sort of the campaign for the Pacific. A land where time stands still is really almost self-explanatory in terms of, if you've ever gone to certain parts of the world, and obviously Solomon's being one of them, certainly as soon as you get off the mainland, get out of the airport and out the main hubbub that is Honiara, you are getting into islands where basically land or time has stood still, and it's looking as if you've gone back, you know, hundreds of years. People are still living a very, very simple existence, which is really fascinating to see. And for me, it was a big part of my enjoyment of whilst I was out there, not just the diving, just being sort of a part of their culture, even though it was for a fraction of time. So, sorry, a little bit about me in terms of the diving history. So I've been diving since 1991, and I've been an instructor since 2002. I have done you know, something over 4,500 dives. I can't remember, to be perfectly honest. As you can see there, that's a sort of a little list of sort of where I've been diving. But basically, when I became an instructor, I lived out in Thailand. So I know that area. I was out there for a year and a half. I subsequently moved to the Caribbean, was out there for 2.5 years. And I've dived a lot of the islands, I think about 18 different sort of island nations. And then a lot of people might sort of know me from my time in Truk. I was in Truk Lagoon for the best part of 2.5 years. I finished there in the back end of 2010. Subsequently came back to the UK and started work for Dive Worldwide in early 2011. Literally, I think it was April 2011. So we're pretty much there for a 10-year anniversary, which is sort of hard to sort of fathom at times. But anyway, Solomon Islands. So what are they? Okay, so the Solomon Islands, as you can see, they're an archipelago of many, many tropical islands. They reckon about 992 of them, with their atolls extending a huge sort of area, 1,800 kilometers. Vast majority of the population are made up of Melanesians. And then there are the Polynesians and the Micronesians. And then I would guess that the remainder are made up of sort of Caucasians coming out of sort of Australia, New Zealand, that sort of thing. Just a bit of a brief history in terms of modern day history for the Solomons. The Germans were basically administering the islands up until 1900. And then they handed over their interest to the Brits. And this was fairly sort of common at that time, and especially after the First World War. But anyway, the administration came over to the Brits, and then it came entirely under sort of British rule. But the bit that I was sort of more sort of interested, if you like, was the Second World War history, which in fact is only a very short period of time. It ran from about July 1942 to early sort of March, April 1943. So we're only talking the best part of sort of 6, 7, 8. It was short, but it was an incredibly sort of strategically important part of their sort of history. It was also a very bloody history. And anyway, as a consequence of getting fed up with the Brits, as most people do, they gained their full independence in 1978 and ultimately sort of became completely independent as a result. So how do I get to the Solomon Islands? Because the Solomons, for a lot of people, is probably a place that they may have heard of, but they're not entirely sure where it is. Typically speaking, if you're flying out of Europe or flying out of London, we're going to go in via Brisbane, obviously in Australia, but it's not the one and only place. I personally did a twin center with Fiji. So my flight plan was moving from London via Seoul in South Korea down to Fiji. I had a night there, and then I popped over to the Solomons, had my time in the Solomons, then went back to Fiji. I was in Fiji for a couple more weeks, I think it was, and then I came back via Seoul. But typically, a lot of people will go in via Brisbane, but you could link it in with Fiji, you could link it in with Papua New Guinea, you could link it in with a couple of others. In terms of a map, I think you can all see my little sort of my mouse cursor. You've obviously got Australia here, and then Brisbane is going to be here on the sort of Queensland coast. Papua New Guinea is this obviously big sort of island chunk up here of green, and then the Solomons sits off the southeast. So Papua New Guinea basically flows into northern Solomon Islands, and then that keeps on going down and almost becomes Vanuatu. Fiji is this little area here. So you get a sort of a bit of a feel for the South Pacific. Up to the north, you've got the Federated States of Micronesia, so that is the likes of Truk Lagoon. You've got Palau, and then over here you've got French Polynesia and Tahiti. So within reason, it's all in that sort of part of the world, but as you can imagine, that part of the world is made up of tiny little dots covering a huge expanse. So nothing is particularly close to anywhere. This is the sort of the current flight plan that Solomon Airlines are operating. So as you can see, they're sort of using Brisbane as a bit of a hub. And you can bounce up to the Solomons, you can bounce over to Papua New Guinea. And as I said, I came in from Fiji, but I actually flew with Fiji Airlines, which had a direct flight, certainly at that time. Not entirely sure if that's still the case. And then zoning in on the Solomons themselves, as you can see, it's quite a sort of elongated chain of islands covering a huge area. The principal town or principal island goes by the name of Guadalcanal, which is also the name of the famous sea battle, excuse me, which we'll talk about in due course. So on the main island of Guadalcanal is Honiara, which is the sort of capital city or town. It's basically where the airport is and where a sort of couple of hotels, nothing too dramatic. We'll talk at the very end as well. We've got a couple of land-based resort options which are in this general area. So Gizo is pretty much the home of a place called Sambis Island Resort. And then New Georgia, there's a beautiful little resort called Upi or Uepi, which is right here. So basically you'd fly into Honiara and then you'd fly up to Segi or to Gizo to get over there as well. The area that I covered, if you take down here, Honiara. So Honiara is, as I said, the main town. That is where the main airport is. And from the airport down to the dock, it's not far. It's a bumpy old road, but it's probably only about 20 minutes, give or take. There are a few hotels in that area because Honiara plays host to sort of the NGOs, the non-government agencies, charity workers, etc. So there's some pretty smart hotels there that you can stay overnight. But anyway, that's where we sort of picked up the boat. And then I sailed over to the Russell Islands, had a few days there before going to Mary Island, then going up to Morovo Lagoon, and then double backing to Florida, and then crossing this famous area here called the Iron Bottom Sound. Okay, and we'll talk about that in due course as well. Okay, sorry, I've just got some notes on a different system here. So, why bother going to the Solomons in the first place? In all honesty, one of the reasons that I really think you should go there is basically because nobody else does. Looking at the most recent tourism numbers that we have, in 2019, they say that there are just under 29,000 visitors. So they will be tourists and charity workers and basically anybody coming off an airplane. So there's only like 29,000 of those, and they reckon only about 2,000 divers, which is a very small number of people. Whereas when you look at somewhere like the Maldives, just for the sake of example, and same year, you got 2 million people visiting. Okay, so huge, huge difference. And they reckon in the Maldives, about 15% of those tourists are going to be divers. So that equates to about 300,000. I have no idea what it's like for the Red Sea, but you can see here the reason why I thought it was so exciting is basically because it's a land untouched. People don't go there. Majority of the tourists are either going to come up from New Zealand and Australia because geographically it's closer, or they're coming in from the States. There are very, very few who would come over from Europe. Okay, a little bit now about its history, because the World War history is of significance, not just to the diving, but just to the development of the islands. And it was quite reminiscent of my time in Truk, because Truk is all about the Second World War and about Japanese and Americans meeting, etc., etc. So basically, what happened is, in case you have forgotten your sort of Pacific history, 7th of December 1941 was the date that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Obviously, a very significant moment in time. Obviously, drew the Americans into the war that otherwise they had seen as being a predominantly European war, and they had no sort of real interest in it. And so at that stage, the Americans started to sort of build up their sort of bases and start to move back across the Pacific. In the meantime, Imperial Japan were sort of attempting to take resources, land, airfields in Papua New Guinea and the Solomons. So in April 1942, that is what they were trying to establish, but they basically failed to establish anything in Papua New Guinea, although there was a big battle in Rabaul. But they did manage to sort of succeed and land in Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands. And they started to establish various airfields. The primary one is a place called Henderson Airfield, which is basically what is now the airport. And the reason why the Japanese were wanting the Solomon Islands was really twofold. They wanted to create a chink in the supply chain basically leading from Australia to the US, because Australia was able to resupply the USA for their sort of iron and steel sort of making facilities, and for food, all of that sort of thing. But also the Japanese wanted the airfields because that would allow them to launch aerial attacks onto mainland Australia. So strategically it became very important, and they were very close to being able to launch into Australia coming out of the Solomons. So basically when the Americans started to sort of go back across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, really became their primary focus. And from there, they were able to push north and go up to the sort of likes of Peleliu in Palau, and go up to Iwo Jima, to Truk Lagoon, blah, 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 on their way up, back up to Japan itself. So it is significant, but it's a very short sort of history as such. So basically on the dawn of August the 7th, 1942, that is when the American Navy started to basically shell heavily the island of Guadalcanal. And sort of once they had established a little bit of a sort of a foothold, if you like, the American Marines were able to get ashore and start to sort of move through the jungle, because that's what Solomons is basically all about. It's just jungle and white sandy beaches and pretty corals, etc. And initially they had very little resistance because, well, basically they had a full sense of security, because just as what the Japanese were doing in various other places, the Japanese went to ground and they were building their shelters in the labyrinth of like honeycomb hills, if you like. So a lot of those hills, limestone type hills, they could find caves and caverns and they could hide in them. So the Americans would sort of, you know, put the scouts out to try and see if they could spot any enemy. Couldn't see anything apart from sort of jungle and bushland. So they started to advance up all of these hills, and then all of a sudden out come machine guns and start mowing them down. And it was really quite an horrific sort of battles from what we can gather. So basically it was very bloody, huge loss of life on both sides. And ultimately it got to the stage where the Americans were able to establish themselves, and bit by bit start to take back the land and start to take back the airfields that had either been built or were in the process of being built. And then basically they pushed the Japanese from one side of the island of Guadalcanal over to the other. And then the Japanese Navy were able to come in the dead of night, pick them all up and take them off to sort of other places to fight another day. Okay, so that was a land battle, but there was also a huge a battle in and around what they call Iron Bottom Sound, which is a big chunk of water. There were 6 naval battles between August 42 and February 43. What they reckon is that the Japanese lost about 31,000 people, and they about 1,000 were captured, and then the Allies, predominantly the Americans, they lost just over 7,000. They reckon about 4,200 were wounded, but then they lost thousands more to tropical disease and to malaria. And when it came to the naval battle in Iron Bottom Sound, the Allies lost about 29 ships and 615 aircraft, to be exact. And the Japanese lost about 38 ships and about 800 aircraft. So we're talking huge amounts. And it all went down in this area here called, right here at the bottom, this is Guadalcanal, Big Island. Okay, so this is basically where the Americans started to initially sort of bomb. This is the Henderson Airfield, which was this strategic point. And then you can see here, there was all sorts of both American and Japanese. The Japanese are going to be in red and the Americans are in blue. And they had these great big battles around Savo Island. And it all happened predominantly dead of night. They didn't really have sonar. So these ships were literally on top of each other, almost bumping into each other. They could pretty much do sort of hand-to-hand combat. But, you know, as soon as they realized that another ship was in front of them, they just sunk it. So anyway, there's a huge amount of military hardware down there. And of course, you then start thinking, oh, is this a good place to go sort of wreck diving and stuff? I did a couple of these wrecks along this coastline, but that's mostly because these are basically being run ashore. They're right up on the beach themselves. We're talking, you know, 5, 10, 15 meters. a lot of the water out here is deep, and we're talking an average of like 600-700 meters. So some of those areas, especially I think around here, are going to be in excess of 1,000 meters deep. So it's just inaccessible to all but sort of little submarines, etc. So there are some wrecks out there that are diveable, that is for sure. The visibility is not terribly great, so it hasn't really established itself as being a sort of a wreck diving capital per se. Okay, so now we get onto the nitty gritty, the more exciting bit, if you like. So what is it that, what's it like to dive there, and what am I likely to see? Okay, I was very fortunate when I went over there. I was hosted on this lovely liveaboard called the Bilikiki. It's very well established. It's been out there donkey's years. Okay, it's not maybe not the prettiest of boats. It's not sort of like you'd see elsewhere in the Maldives or in the Red Sea, for example, but it's very big, it's very functional. It was perfectly adequate for the time that I had on, and it just sort of blends into the island itself. If you had something really big and swanky and sort of nouveau riche, I don't think it'd work really. So this is something that has been there for many, many years. It has 10 deluxe cabins, which are basically 8 have got a double bed with a single sort of bunk bed on top of it. And then I was in one of twin beds, 2 twin beds, which have no bunks, so basically 2 beds plus a little ensuite. So you've got 24 passengers, or 24 divers maximum. And then you've got about 11 crew. The crew are going to be from the islands themselves, but then they're going to be managed by 2 international staff. So when I was out there were 2 Europeans, sort of husband and wife team who'd been there for a few years. And then subsequently they get Australians or Americans, etc. So typically your cruise directors are going to be white, dare say. You're going to be sort of European, or they're going to be sort of an international flair. But the crew, again, they've been there for years, and they knew exactly what to do, and they knew exactly sort of what boxes to tick. And just a wonderful, wonderful environment to be on, to be honest. In terms of the package on the boat itself, it's pretty standard in terms of they'll include your airport transfers or your hotel transfers if you're going to overnight in advance. You'll get tea, water, tea, coffee, drinking water, that sort of thing, maybe a soft drink. Full board, food was absolutely plentiful. It was predominantly on a sort of help yourself a buffet style. Your snacks, whatever diving package you're on, nitrox, etc. And then they'll do these sort of fishing excursions, and we did land excursions, which I'll talk about. And then they've now got some stand-up paddle boards as well. Not that, to be honest, you can have a huge amount of time to get those things out, but it's an opportunity to do that. In terms of how the boat looks and feels, this is obviously the upper deck. So that was a lovely place to go up and get a little bit of sunshine. When I was out there, I can't remember any rain at all. It was bone dry. And I do remember, admittedly, I was a bit tired, maybe had a beer or 2, but going up there at night, just lying down on the sun deck, and you look up and the sky was just beautiful and magnificent. I mean, the Milky Way was right there, almost you could almost touch it. It was just so bright and vibrant. I'd never seen it quite as clear as that. You start to think you're hallucinating, to be honest, but it's not quite like that. Top right, this bit is sort of undercover, so to speak. So that's where we tended to have most meals. But at the back here, you may be able to see this back table. I actually sat there. That is not undercover. So when the sun was out, or when it was sort of a pleasant time to eat, then that's where we were. Obviously, if it starts to rain, you can bring down the awnings, and that was all fine. But basically, it's a fairly simple sort of layout of the boat. And likewise at the back, here on the stern, you've got sort of obviously the area where all the tanks are laid out, with the wetsuits right here in the middle. So there was plenty of room. As I said, there was like 20, 24. I think when I was there, about 16 of us in total. But certainly I would imagine with 24 people, you weren't falling over on top of you, of each other. So it was all very sort of easy. There wasn't anything sort of to be sort of concerned about, so to speak. In terms of how you actually dive, Occasionally, I jumped off the back of the mother boat, but 99% of the diving is on these little skiffs. Very simple little, if you like, speedboats. They probably only go 10 miles an hour, 15 miles an hour. Nothing sort of dramatic, but all they need to do is really take you from the back or from the side of the mothership, and then they take you along the reef. But you're only on board those things for literally 1 or 2 minutes. That was it. There was no sort of jumping on board and going off to sea and being back pounded by the waves. The reefs were pretty much right in front of you, and that's why you could jump off the off the Bilikiki itself and dive the reef right there. But generally speaking, they would take you like a kilometer up the reef, and then you would gently swim back, or you drift back towards the mothership. It was very, very simple. And the way they designed it as well, yes, it was semi-regimented insofar as, okay, we might have 2 or 3 groups of people, and okay, group 1, could you start to gear up, and could you sort of give everybody else a bit of space on the dive deck, blah, blah, blah. Certainly when I was out there, there was a group of about 12, all of whom knew each other, a bunch of Americans, but that was absolutely fine. So they would predominantly sort of gear up first, jump on the skiffs, and likewise, the skiffs aren't going to wait until, okay, we've got 10 people, now we can go. Literally, if they saw that 2 or 3 people were ready, but their mates were not quite ready, then they would take the 2 or 3, take them up the reef, if you like, drop them off, let those guys sort of do, buoyancy checks or whatever they're going to do, and then they would just go backwards and forwards. And it was all very, very sort of laissez-faire and relaxed. So ultimately, when I was there, I was diving with another guy called Chris, an American, and we just let them all go. We let them sort of do their own thing, get in the water, kick up the sand if that's what they're going to do. So we were generally running, 5-10 minutes behind everybody else, which was absolutely fine. And so by the time our little skiff picked us up and took us over there, we basically just have the reef to ourselves. And as we went through the week, there was a couple of others, brothers, and they sort of cottoned on to the fact that we probably had a better time of it and we weren't getting involved in the sort of the bigger group. And again, they just sort of came along with us. So we turned into a group of 4, and we just had an absolutely smashing time of it. As I said, it was very relaxed. Nobody felt pressured to get in the water at any certain time. Nobody felt pressured to get out of the water. Yes, they may say, look, we're going to leave after lunch, but all of our dives were well in excess of an hour. I mean, we were typically diving, 75 minutes, that sort of thing. And the reason being is that very few of the dives were at considerable depth. You might hit 30, but most of the time you were diving in around, 22, 20 meters. And then you were just leveling it up, and you'd end up doing the last, 15 minutes really in water that was good enough to snorkel. It was beautiful, shallow, 5 meters, crystal clear, got all the sunshine, and you'd be under the canopy of the overhanging sort of the branches and the vines from the jungle, or they could be from other sort of bushes, etc., etc. And it was just a beautiful way to finish the dive because it was so calm, so chilled, and you'd pop up, and everybody was like whispers, and you'd hear the sort of, you could actually see butterflies, you could hear the birds cheeping, and it's just it was my type of diving. It wasn't, I mean, I love adrenaline diving and it has its place, but this was just very nice, very, very easy and relaxed. So this is one of the sort of the more famous dive sites. It's a place called Legroom Cut, and it's in the Russell Islands. So this is sort of almost like a first stop that we did. As you can see, it's a cut. So they drop you off on the outskirts, outside of this island, and then you've got this cut going straight through, and it is literally only about 4 or 5 meters wide. At its deepest, maybe about 20 meters, but it goes into the island probably in excess of 150, 200 meters. So they dropped you off, and you sort of get all your bits and pieces, your paraphernalia. As Chris and I entered, we saw all the other people leaving, so we had the cut to ourselves, and which is great because sort of I like to sort of double with my camera a bit, and Chris was a beautiful photographer. But basically we just went into this cut at about 4 or 5 meters, get to the end, and then come back. You go down and come back, so we're coming out at about 15 meters. But it was all about the timing of the lights. So we would go there at about midday. The sun is beaming straight down on top of you, and you get these shards of light. and it just was absolutely breathtaking, really, really sensational. There's no particular sort of things to look at inside in terms of marine life. You're not going to come across a whale shark in there, and you're not going to come across too much beautiful coral. It was just the atmosphere of it, and it was, in my mind, very, very unique. And it was certainly one dive that I will remember really for the rest of my life. And it was sort of mirrored in various other sort of reef systems there. You would see these cuts, or you might go down, 3, 4, 5 meters, and you'd suddenly see a bit of an overhang, and you'd swim under there, and you realize that this was actually some sort of little cave system, and you could swim in, and suddenly you'd realize, there's light coming in from somewhere else, and you just follow your nose, follow your eyes. And it was really quite fun, because after we'd done this 2 or 3 times in various little areas, you realize that what you were doing is swimming into the inside, if you like, of an island, and the island could be tiny, but you were popping up in an internal lagoon, an internal pond. And it was quite funny, because we would look at each other as to who's going to go first, me or my buddy, because we also knew that if you popped up first, you weren't quite sure what you were going to see in and around the jungle area, because it is known in that part of the world, in Solomons and Papua New Guinea, you're not necessarily going to get sharks in that area, but you're going to get saltwater crocodiles, and they are there. We didn't see any, but you do wonder, if you pop your head up, is somebody else going to be there to meet you? So it became a bit of after you go up first. No, after you. So we do that a few times, and obviously have a little bit of a laugh as a result. But it's again, it was one of those sort of memorable sort of types of dive. This is another sort of famous site out there. Obviously, you wouldn't necessarily know about it here, but this is called White Beach. Those pillars there is actually, it's the same background pretty much as the photo that you're looking of me. But that background there, those pillars are marking where they had like a pontoon, like a pier. So everywhere that is, the jungle, all that greenery, that used to be an American air base, or a military base. So that was all concreted. Then they would have this pier coming out, and then you would have the big ships that were able to line up on the outside of this pier along this area here. And basically they would use it to sort of resupply. So there's sort of ammunition and everything else. At the end of the war, the Americans weren't going to be sort of taking all of this hardware back with them. And that was pretty common throughout all of their sort of places. So basically all they did is they moved it off the island, because they didn't want the Japanese or anybody else to get hold of it for future. They moved it off the island and just basically pushed it over the edge. So on the outer edge of this pier, it actually drops down quite quickly, down to about sort of 30, 40 meters. And that would be our dive. And there you're looking at sort of memorabilia. There was, I think there was a tank or two. Certainly there were some trucks. But funny enough, there were just dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of Coke bottles, Coca-Cola, because that was their supply chain. These guys were drinking Lucky Jims or whatever, and they're drinking Coke, Smart's Coca-Cola. And so you go down there and you will find lots and lots of bottles of Coke. And then when we came back up, just like you're seeing in this little kid here, as we came up, you would be met by some of the local kids. They would just swim out, say hello. By this time, we're sort of on the surface. I don't think we needed picking up by the skiff. We could just swim back sort of to the boat itself. But these kids would just come out and play with you and sort of have the photographs taken. And it was all just part and parcel of what they do. I mean, we were basically going to be the only tourists that they were going to see in their lifetime, I would suggest. But the boat would come around, on an itinerary, might come around every 10 days, every 2 weeks. So these kids knew the local crew, and they knew basically if they did what sort of the tourists wanted, they might get, a can of Coke for themselves, or they might get a couple of dollars if they came back to the boat with us, etc. It's all part and parcel. It was great. This is another sort of reef. This is called Mary's Island. It's a simple reef. You might be able to see there. It's quite jagged. There was no real sort of coral, etc. But it was just a magnet for fish, and in particular these jacks. There were just tens of thousands of jacks, and I was just in my element there. There was, an undersea mount, probably only about 15, 20 meters deep at its max, if you like, and they would have these little bowls. And you just sit in the bowls and the fish would just swarm on top of you. But instead of sort of being in areas where you might have little glass fish, for example, this time you've got all of these jacks. And as I said, there were thousands of them, and they would swim around you, swirl, 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 swirl. And then suddenly, pow, they'd go off. And it was like a crack of thunder. You'd suddenly hear this noise, and then they would shoot back. So we decided as a collective, we spent the entire day there. I think we did 4 dives on that one seamount. It was just such a beautiful place to be, and the sun was shining and everybody was happy. And ultimately it looks a bit like that, really. I mean, you were right up in amongst it all. I mean, they were sort of smiling as you went past. And then every now and again, you know, you might see a turtle floating by, you might see a bumphead sort of wrasse coming through, you might see a shark if you're lucky. But what I found about the Solomons as a whole, the reason why I loved it so much is there was no 2 dives the same, certainly no 2 days the same. And the reason I say that is I've been lucky enough to go on several liveaboards, etc. You know, sometimes you can go there and the Monday is a bit similar to the Tuesday, or today's dive is a bit similar to what we did yesterday or even this morning. And it gets to a stage where you start to go, okay, I can't really remember what I did. I haven't really sort of taken count of my logbook, for example. And it may get to the stage on day 3, day 4, where you start to think, do I want to do that 3rd or 4th dive? Would I rather, you know, sit and read a book, or sort of just chill, have a beer, or even watch a movie? When I was in the Solomons, it was not like that. Every single dive was just full of energy, and we just all wanted to just do one dive after another. Admittedly, I didn't do every night dive, but certainly 4 dives a day during the day, and you just knew that this was a special place. You just knew that everything was different and it was untouched, it was unspoilt. Dare I say it, the Chinese fishing fleet haven't been there. They haven't been sort of taking everything. Everything was pristine the way it should be. And places like that are very special. And they're obviously very remote from our point of view, difficult to get to, but, you know, it's just a magical place, and I absolutely adored it. So there you go. So this is typical of what you might see in terms of untouched sort of reefs and walls. And again, you could have coral gardens. You would have these sort of funny mounds of coral, which are almost like sort of little hillocks, green coral. It was just went for field of field of field. You could have deep drop-offs, you could have drift dives, you could have night dives, you could have day dives, you could have macro, you could have big stuff. We didn't see any, you know, we didn't see whale sharks. They don't really get whale sharks. Same with mantas, unfortunately. There were mobula rays that we saw quite a few sort of different types of sharks, but nothing big. It's just one of those places where, you know, if you like macro, if you like octopus, if you like looking at, you know, not just 1 or 2 bumphead parrotfish, but maybe 30 or 40 in one spot, that's the sort of diving it was. It's a little bit different to the norm, and it's not what people are accustomed to. So, you know, you're going to have some people go, oh, I'm not sure about this. But things like the Gorgonian Sea Fans, you know, sea fan could be the size of your laptop. It could be the size of your desk, for example. These things were almost the size of your house. We are talking 15 foot high. We're talking as wide as I am, if not bigger. And they would be one after the other. It's like a windbreak of fans going from shallow down to the depths. And you just follow this line of Gorgonians. And in amongst it all, obviously you're looking for pygmy seahorse, which are there. We did see them, but good luck in trying to find them by yourself, because they're a nightmare, as you can imagine. But that's the sort of dives that we're talking about. The color, the variety of corals was everywhere to see. And as a result, I would absolutely call it a photographer's paradise. There's so much sort of about it. And I play around with this. This is my photo of my buddy. He obviously has all the paraphernalia. I just had a little sort of point and shoot, and that's fine. But you could get some beautiful, beautiful images, even when you're like me and you really have no clue about what's happening with photography. You just sort of turn up, take a photo. I'm a great one for sort of natural light photography, basically because I don't know how to use my flashes, etc. But anyway, there you go, photographer's paradise. Another big part of the trip, from my point of view, is the interaction that you'd get with the local people. So this is the shopping. And the Bilikiki crew, or the boat, has basically just become established. They will do whatever they can to sort of mix and mingle, if you like, with the local population. So every day or every 2 or 3 days, they would be on different islands, but the local ladies and their kids, I'm assuming the men were sort of at work or watching football or doing something else, I'm not sure, but they would just turn up with all the fruit and veg, which is, and the boat almost had a policy of whatever they've got, we'll buy, and we'll pay, I've seen this in other parts of the world as well, we'll pay a little bit more than they would get if they took it to the market. So if they turned up with abundance of pineapple, then guess what? We're going to have a lot of pineapple that week, and likewise bananas and green beans and sort of cashews or whatever it may be. And it was just a beautiful thing to do, and there was lots of colour, lots of joy. And one of the guys who was on my trip, he had I'd never seen it before, but a digital Polaroid camera, so something from the 70s and 80s, but a digital version. And he just went down and quietly took photographs of these little kids and then gave them the Polaroid film, and they'd end up sort of wafting in the face. And then you could see it developing in front of them. And they were just blown away by this. They just had no idea. They were accustomed to seeing images on the back of a digital camera, but they'd never actually seen it on a Polaroid. So it's just absolutely beautiful. This is something else that we did in a surface interval. I'm very fortunate, sort of come off the dive, and we're surrounded by a whole bunch of pilot whales. There was just 2 of us on the skiff going back to the boat, so we're able to just quickly jump in. There's probably about 20 or 30 pilot whales. That's about as close as we got to them. It's one of those things, you go back to the boat and tell all the other people sort of what you've just seen, and of course they have no interest in it whatsoever because they didn't see it, and therefore it didn't exist. So be it. Another part is sort of going onto the islands. This is an area that I really did enjoy in particular. The little kids would be there to meet you. They don't speak a word of English, but that's fine. They got this wonderful blonde hair. It's not because they put sort of lemon in their hair and think they're Jason Donovan or anything like that. But basically they would, they've got a genetics. It's all genetic. They have blonde hair when they are born, and then it will go dark as they age. But they'd be there to do the sort of meet and greet. And the reason why you're there for on this particular island was for the wood carvings, which were just beautiful, all handmade, self-taught, hard wood with sort of inlays, etc. I've got a couple of things here. So I've got some salad spoons. Don't know if you can see that. There we go. And you can see that there's some pearl inlays. And then I've got this rather nice sort of canoe that is sitting on its own little turtle. And it's even got the little paddles that go with it. I don't know if you can see those. So these sort of things, you're told in advance sort of how to go about bartering with these guys, what sort of prices to pay, because obviously you have no idea. And likewise, they say, look, if you can go ahead take other things with you, like I had pens and paper, and I always take sort of reading glasses with me as well, so that you can give them to the local people. But I also knew that this was going to happen, so I took some dodgy football shirts, and I'm not even into football, but there's now some kids running around with Manchester United and some Chelsea football shirts, courtesy of me. Because basically you might say, okay, I will give you, $20 for this, but I'll also give you a t-shirt as well, blah, blah, blah. So these wood carvings are absolutely beautiful. I mean, you could bring them back to the UK and sell them for an absolute fortune, to be honest. Something else that we were sort of, that we had were, they would give the customary sort of singing and dancing. So these are obviously the men doing their version of a modern day sort of tribal sort of dance, if you like, almost like a warrior spirit. And then the women would sort of follow them up, and they would do their sort of singing and dancing. And then we would just be sat there like a bunch of numpties, like a bunch of tourists, literally with a coconut, having a little drink. And then the village elder, or the village chief, then took us on a nice little sort of tour around the village, so you could get a better feel for how they lived and the huts that they made. And they were all on stilts to keep them out of the water should there be a sort of storm surge. They had a little bit of electricity because I think the Australian charities had given them some solar powered units. So occasionally you would hear some radio or something else going on in the background, or sort of electricity cables. But that was just a fascinating way to spend a surface interval. I mean, an hour and a half, something like that. And then when it came to the end of my time on liveaboard, I stayed there for another like 24 hours. And then they purposely went to this museum, which is basically somebody's back garden, bizarrely enough. And all he has done is somehow he has got Japanese and American artifacts, dragged them off the beaches, dragged them out of the jungle, dragged them along to his back garden, and that is now a museum. And it's really quite a fascinating place to see. I mean, there's an American sort of plane where the wings literally fold up because they go onto the aircraft carriers. And so they literally come along, they pull the switch, and those wings will still fold up to this day. It's really quite fascinating. Okay, in terms of what we at Dive Worldwide can offer you, predominantly there are two liveaboards out there. One is currently known as the Solomon PNG Master, part of the Worldwide Dive and Sail fleet. We now understand that that's probably going to drop the PNG bit and will become the Solomon Master, concentrating on Solomon Islands. I was on the Bilikiki, as you can see there. Bit of detail about the Bilikiki, have a look on our website. We'll give you a whole lot more. Likewise, if you want to look at the Solomon Master, you can do so. And then these are the couple of the islands that we're talking about. So we've got Sambis Island, which is near Gizo, and Uepi Island as well. As I said, I did my sort of liveaboard out of Oniara, but if you fly over, this is Uepi Island is over here, and then Sambis Island is around Gizo. Okay, so you're going to take an internal flight and then a boat to get to those islands as well. And then a lot of people might sort of ask quite validly, obviously, sort of what's the weather like in that part of the world? Basically, it's the tropics. It's just south of the equator, only literally a couple of degrees. So that means the weather is warm, it's sunny, and it's also going to be wet. So typically the liveaboards will stop diving January and February. They'll just go off to dry dock, wet dock. That's when it really chucks it down. It's not a monsoon per se, but it's just a very wet season. So they will stay out of it for 2 months, and then the liveaboard will basically go from March through till December. So you're going to have rain, but at some stage that tends to be you wake up to rain and then it gets sort of it'll dry up by lunchtime. By breakfast time. But it's going to be hot, it's going to be sunny, and for the most part, it's just going to be glorious, okay? If you do go ashore, it's going to be hot and it's going to be humid. So as soon as you step on shore, you tend to sort of be sweaty. But when you're on the boats, it's a lot nicer. You obviously got a bit of a sea breeze and the mosquitoes are sort of kept at bay, etc. So liveaboard for me is always the way to go in that sort of part of the world, okay? And that pretty much brings it to an end. So has anybody got any questions? I am going to take off my share. Yeah, and Phil, I'll hand it back to you.
Super. Thank you very much, Charlie. That was absolutely fascinating. I hope everybody found that as inspiring and informative as I did. I have heard it all before a few years ago, but it's wonderful to hear it again and to share in your passion for the destination, Charlie, and your in-depth knowledge. That was really, really interesting. As Charlie said, if anybody has got any questions they want to ask now that are in their mind, please do just pop them on the chat, and we will be very happy to answer them now. And if we don't know the answers, then of course we'll be very happy to find out about them. So I'll just give a moment in case anybody's frantically typing their question, just to see if any pop up. Okay, we've got none at the moment, but obviously if they come in, that's fine. You can follow up on email to either myself or Charlie. If you just drop a line to sales@diveworldwide.com or our personal emails if you've got it, and we will be delighted to answer any questions. If you've been inspired to visit the Solomon Islands as a result of Charlie's talk, or it's somewhere that you have always been interested in, then we'd like to thank you for joining Charlie's presentation this evening, and we're offering £100 off for a trip. For everyone that joined the Zoom call, we will follow up with you by email. I believe we've got everybody's email from the sign up, so we'll follow up with more details of that in the coming days. So the last thing just for me to say is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, on the 31st of March, we have another talk planned on Papua New Guinea to give you a tour of another really magical and special destination. If you go to the Dive Worldwide website, then you will see a little events tab, and then you can subscribe to that. We hope we will have everybody traveling again soon, but we will continue to sort of do these Zoom calls for the period at least where we can't travel, as an opportunity to engage with everybody and hopefully sort of inspire you for your next diving trips as soon as we can dive again. Just got a couple of things here on chat, bear with me. Yeah, lots of inspiring comments from a couple of people that have been before and are obviously looking to go again. So I think that's a wrap. Thank you very much for joining us. We wish you an enjoyable rest of the evening. I think at 8 o'clock we've got a clap to mark, unfortunately, a year anniversary since our first lockdown that we had for COVID. And hopefully this one will be the last, and we'll all be able to get you all traveling and diving again soon. So thank you very much for joining. Thank you to you, Charlie, for an absolutely brilliant presentation. And we look forward to speaking with you and hopefully seeing you again sometime very soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Guys, thank you.